Welcome to the debate. Imagine you're walking into a courtroom and you're facing this massive, life-altering lawsuit.
Okay, high stakes. I'm with you.
Right, so you sit down at the defense table and you suddenly realize the attorney you just hired to protect you, well, they are also on retainer for the person suing you.
Wow. Yeah, you would immediately question their loyalty.
Exactly. You demand a new attorney on the spot. We expect our advocates to be entirely in our corner, especially when the stakes are that high.
It's an automatic, glaring conflict of interest. You wouldn't just question it, you'd probably fire them immediately.
Yes, because we demand absolute, undivided loyalty in law, in finance, in medicine. It is a binary expectation. But, when you step into the world of real estate, suddenly that clear line becomes incredibly blurry.
Oh, absolutely.
That courtroom scenario sounds absurd, but for decades, it was essentially the reality of buying a house. Historically, the industry operated under this system called sub-agency.
Right, which is just wild to think about now.
It really is. It meant even the friendly agent driving you around in their own car to look at houses on a Sunday afternoon, legally, they were bound to get the highest possible price for the seller, not you.
It is the absolute definition of professional muddy waters. And, even as sub-agency kind of faded out, dual agency, where one agent represents both the buyer and the seller in the exact same transaction, it became standard operating procedure.
Which is crazy.
Right, and it's exactly why the industry is currently under such intense scrutiny. If you are a listener trying to buy your first home right now, you are walking into an inherently adversarial financial environment, and you've often got, your life savings on the line.
And that brings us to the shifting landscape of real estate representation today. Specifically, we're looking at the role of the Accredited Buyer's Representative, or the ABR designation.
Presented by the Center for Realtor Development.
Exactly. Today, we are examining the official ABR guidelines and the literature detailing this certification's requirements to determine its true value. The central question we have to answer is this: does earning the ABR designation translate into a measurable structural advantage for homebuyers during high-stakes moments? Or is it primarily, a marketing credential that simply formalizes the baseline skills any competent real estate agent should already possess?
A badge on a business card, basically.
Right. Now, I argue that the ABR is a vital standardized differentiator that genuinely guarantees dedicated buyer advocacy in a highly complex market.
And I take the position that while buyer advocacy is absolutely essential, the ABR requirements reflect foundational competence rather than some elite, distinct level of expertise. I look at it as a badge that signals basic best practices, not a structural transformation of an agent's abilities.
Well, let me lay out why I view the ABR designation as a highly substantive credential and not just a badge. It's not a participation trophy that gets handed out just for paying your annual dues.
Okay. But it's not exactly a master's degree either.
No, but the National Association of Realtors' own syllabus requires agents to complete an official 2-day ABR designation course, plus an additional qualifying elective. But the most critical requirement, and really the engine of this whole designation, is that they must provide proof of completing 5 transactions solely as a buyer's representative.
Right. Solely.
Exactly. 0 dual agency is permitted in those qualifying deals. By enforcing strict adherence to exclusive buyer representation, this structured training yields actual measurable advantages. It fundamentally shifts how an agent operates during critical, high-stress phases like negotiations, inspections, and closing.
Because they have the reps?
Because they have a proven track record of prioritizing the buyer's needs above all else, yes.
Well, I come at it from a different way. We both absolutely agree that exclusive buyer representation is paramount. Like, nobody wants a dual agent when they're fighting over closing costs.
Definitely not.
But we really have to look at the actual barrier to entry for this designation. A 2-day course, 1 elective, and merely 5 transactions. In the context of an active real estate professional's career, 5 transactions is a remarkably low volume.
It depends on the market, but sure.
A highly successful agent might close 5 deals in a single month. Does doing that, plus, sitting in a classroom for 2 days, suddenly grant them advanced negotiation tactics?
I think it does.
The true value a home buyer receives comes from an agent's intrinsic negotiation skills, their deep local market experience, and just their personal dedication, not a 2-day seminar.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because you are focusing purely on the numerical volume rather than the structural limitation placed on those 5 transactions. Let's talk about the dual agency trap for a second.
Okay.
In a standard transaction, an agent is often financially incentivized to keep a deal together at all costs. Sometimes they even represent both sides to double their commission. Human nature makes it incredibly tempting to smooth over flaws in a property if it means getting to the closing table twice as fast.
Which is a massive problem in the industry. Yes, I fully agree.
Right. But the ABR requirement structurally removes that temptation in those qualifying deals. When an agent is forced to complete 5 complex deals where that temptation is legally and functionally removed, it rewires their brain. They are forced to build what I call adversarial negotiation muscles.
Adversarial negotiation muscles. Okay.
Yeah, they have to sit across the table from the seller's agent and fight exclusively for their client without the safety net of playing both sides. It isn't about the volume of 5 deals. It's the fact that those 5 deals prove the agent has navigated the complexities of a transaction with absolute uncompromised loyalty to the buyer. That is a massive differentiator.
But is it genuinely a massive differentiator, or is it just the bare minimum we should expect?
I mean,
If I hire someone to represent me, I expect them not to represent the person I'm negotiating against. That shouldn't require an acronym after their name. It should be the foundational ethic of the job itself.
but historically it hasn't been.
True, but if you look at the ABR's own literature, they claim this gives agents advanced insights. I really question whether avoiding dual agency for 5 transactions truly qualifies as advanced, or if it merely certifies a beginner's baseline. A homebuyer doesn't care about the acronym on a business card. They care if their agent can win them a bidding war without overpaying.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. It's not just about sitting in a classroom or checking off 5 deals. It's about what the curriculum actually demands of the agent's daily operations. The ABR framework fundamentally shifts how an agent operates from day one.
How so? Give me an example.
While the material focuses heavily on conducting structured, effective buyer counseling sessions to uncover client needs before they ever step foot in a house. Let's look at how this plays out in the real world. Let's look at Clara Okechukwu, for instance.
Okay, yeah.
She's a prime local example of an ABR-certified agent serving highly competitive markets in Nassau County, Suffolk County, and Queens. Because of her ABR training, she utilizes her expertise to offer these free, highly structured buyer consultations up front.
And I'm sure Clara is an excellent agent, but free consultations are incredibly common. Any agent will meet you at a coffee shop and ask how many bedrooms you want.
They are common, but they aren't often structured through the lens of dedicated advocacy. What Clara does in those consultations goes far beyond asking about bedrooms.
Okay.
The ABR curriculum teaches agents to accurately assess buyer preferences, define risk tolerance, and, crucially, outline exact fiduciary responsibilities transparently. Think of it like a prenuptial agreement.
A prenup for a house hunt?
Yeah, it is a legally and ethically binding framework agreed upon in advance so that when emotions run high, like during an intense bidding war in Queens, the rules of protection are already locked in place. This upfront groundwork directly translates to measurable advantages. Clara knows exactly which levers to pull during a negotiation because she mapped out the buyer's core financial and emotional motivations when everyone's heads were cool.
I hear the theory there, but practically speaking, I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
All right.
Navigating inspections, securing favorable outcomes, and managing a successful closing. Those are the core job descriptions of any realtor. You brought up Clara Okechukwu, and I actually think that's a perfect example, but for the exact opposite reason you're using her.
Really?
Yes, she serves Nassau, Suffolk, and Queens. Those are some of the most complex, fast-moving, and cutthroat real estate markets in the country. I would argue that an agent like Clara is successful because of her individual drive, her deep local market knowledge, and her personal competence.
Well, yes, but
Let me finish. When a home inspector finds a cracked foundation or a faulty HVAC system in a 1950s ranch in Suffolk County, a competent agent uses that information to negotiate a credit or a repair. that isn't exclusive to an ABR. I really question whether a specialized 2-day course genuinely imparts unique tactical skills that standard agents fundamentally lack. The excellence belongs to the agent, not the acronym.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on how systems drive behavior. You're attributing success entirely to individual intrinsic traits, but intrinsic traits need a structural framework to be consistently effective.
I don't know if I agree with that.
Yes, handling an inspection report is standard, but how you handle it mechanically and psychologically changes when you are trained specifically as a buyer's advocate.
How so? Because reading an inspection report is pretty black and white. The roof is leaking or it isn't.
It's not about reading the report. It's about the mechanical pivot in the negotiation. Let's stay with your example of the 1950s ranch in Suffolk County. The inspector finds a faulty HVAC system. If an agent hasn't been strictly trained in exclusive buyer advocacy, their traditional training, which often emphasizes, just closing the transaction, might subconsciously push them to advise the buyer to just ask the seller to patch the system.
Like, let's ask them to fix it so we can keep the deal moving?
Exactly.
Which is a common response, yes.
Right. But the ABR curriculum teaches agents to evaluate that inspection not just as a list of broken items, but as a strategic pivot point to shift financial leverage.
Okay.
Instead of asking for a patch job from a seller who is financially motivated to do the cheapest work possible, the ABR-trained agent uses that flaw to renegotiate the entire closing cost structure. They pivot the negotiation to secure a massive seller concession on closing costs, allowing the buyer to keep their cash on hand and hire their own trusted contractor later.
Sure, but
The ABR framework acts as an insurance policy against the human nature of the agent wanting to rush to a commission. It explicitly trains them to advocate for the buyer's long-term financial interest, even if it threatens the immediate survival of the deal.
That is a compelling argument, but have you considered what the official material actually emphasizes when communicating to the agents themselves? We really have to look at the incentives laid out by the Center for Realtor Development.
Which are what?
Well, if you read their own literature, it states directly that earning the ABR will help you effectively communicate your value and enhance your marketability. It explicitly says that conducting these effective buyer counseling sessions paves the way for a signed buyer representation agreement.
Right.
This proves that the designation is heavily weighted toward agent self-promotion. It's a mechanism to help the agent lock down a client and secure their own commission, rather than strictly elevating consumer protection.
Securing a signed buyer representation agreement is a form of consumer protection. In fact, it is the exact mechanism that legally binds the agent to the buyer's best interests.
the framing is entirely about the agent's success. Listen to the phrasing they use. Unlock your potential. Enhance your success as a buyer's agent. Position yourself to stand out from the crowd. The language of the certification itself is fundamentally rooted in marketing.
I disagree.
It's teaching agents how to sell themselves to the buyer. If the core value was purely structural consumer protection, the focus would be entirely on risk mitigation, contract law, and structural defect identification, rather than paving the way for a signed contract to guarantee the agent gets paid.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because you're treating marketability and consumer protection as mutually exclusive, when in reality they are completely symbiotic.
Symbiotic? How?
Yes. The material teaches agents to communicate their value. But think about why they have to do that. Think about the psychology of a buyer entering this market. They are terrified. They don't know who is on their side. For decades, as we established, buyers operated under the assumption that the agent showing them houses worked for them, when legally they didn't.
True.
By transparently defining their role, articulating their exact responsibilities, and securing a signed agreement, an ABR-certified agent protects the homebuyer from ambiguity.
Transparency is vital, I agree. And I am not arguing against signed agreements. But you don't need a designation to be transparent. A good agent simply looks their client in the eye and explains how the process works.
You don't strictly need one, but having a standardized system ensures it actually happens consistently. When a buyer is in a high-stress negotiation over a bidding war, they need to know without a shadow of a doubt who their agent represents. The ABR provides a standardized script and an ethical boundary that forces that conversation up front.
Okay.
It takes the guesswork out of it. When an agent effectively communicates their value, they are establishing the boundaries of their fiduciary duty. Returning to the prenuptial analogy, that signed agreement is the shield the buyer relies on when the transaction gets difficult. It's the document that says, I am legally bound to fight for you.
Look, I understand the mechanism you're describing, and I agree that clarifying fiduciary duty is crucial. But I still question the depth of the ABR's impact on the actual transaction. Let's return to the specific measurable advantages you mentioned during negotiations and closing.
Okay.
The source material claims the ABR equips agents to skillfully represent and advocate for buyers during negotiations using market insight and negotiation tactics. But market insight isn't learned in a 2-day ABR course.
Well, no, but
Market insight is learned by spending years analyzing micro-pricing trends in Queens or understanding how property taxes fluctuate across different school districts in Nassau County. A 2-day designation course cannot substitute for or even significantly augment the localized hard-won experience that actually wins a negotiation.
it doesn't substitute for local market knowledge. It directs how that knowledge is applied. Let me use Clara Okechukwu again as our lens for this because it perfectly illustrates the intersection of local knowledge and ABR training.
All right, let's hear it.
Clara already knows the nuances of the Nassau and Suffolk County markets. She knows the tax rates. She knows the neighborhood trends. What the ABR designation does is provide her with a specialized buyer-centric framework to apply that local knowledge. When she is at the closing table and a last-minute issue arises, say a final walkthrough reveals that the seller damaged hardwood floors while moving out, she isn't just relying on general market experience.
She's relying on her ability to confront the seller's agent and demand a holdback of funds. Any experienced agent knows how to do that.
Yes, but she is operating under a designation that has explicitly trained her to view that hurdle solely through the lens of buyer protection, entirely uncompromised by any lingering industry norms of dual agency or just trying to keep the peace.
Right, the adversarial muscles.
Exactly. She has the adversarial negotiation muscles we talked about earlier. The ABR training ensures her immediate reflex isn't to mediate a compromise to save the closing timeline, but to aggressively protect her buyer's financial position.
But again, I have to ask, shouldn't every single licensed real estate agent view a closing hurdle through the lens of protecting their client?
Ideally, yes.
Right. If a buyer's agent needs a specialized certificate to remind them not to compromise their client's position at the final walkthrough, we have a much larger problem with basic licensing standards in this industry. I view the ABR as a formalization of basic best practices. It tells the consumer, hey, I have jumped through these specific hoops and I am marketing myself as a specialist. That has value, certainly.
Yes.
It provides a signaling tool. But we shouldn't conflate a signaling tool with a structural overhaul of an agent's fundamental competence.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. You're assuming that basic licensing standards adequately prepare agents for the psychological and tactical complexities of exclusive buyer advocacy. And the truth is, they just don't.
No, they don't.
Basic real estate licensing is heavily focused on property rights, basic contract law, and regulatory compliance. It teaches you how to calculate square footage and how to keep out of jail. It absolutely does not teach you how to masterfully advocate for a buyer's specific emotional and financial motivations during a grueling inspection negotiation. The ABR requires that additional elective and, crucially, those 5 specific solo transactions because it recognizes that dedicated buyer representation is a distinct, highly specialized skill set requiring its own discipline.
Well, I'll certainly concede that basic licensing is woefully inadequate for the realities of today's market. And I will absolutely agree that buyers are deeply benefited by agents who prioritize structured, upfront consultations like the ones we discussed to uncover client motivations before they ever look at properties.
It makes a huge difference.
It does, but I maintain that the ABR's relatively low barrier to entry, a few days of classwork and 5 solo transactions, means we really must view it primarily as a baseline indicator of professional dedication rather than a guarantee of elite negotiation or inspection skills. It is a very good starting point. It shows the agent cares enough to invest in their education,
but it is not the finish line of professional excellence. The individual agent's experience and grit will always outweigh the acronym.
And I would summarize my position by stating that the ABR designation, precisely because of its strict requirement against dual agency and its targeted curriculum on buyer counseling, sets a necessary and measurable standard. It forces agents to structurally commit to dedicated buyer advocacy by building those adversarial negotiation muscles and enforcing upfront transparency. It provides tangible structural advantages to consumers navigating the inherently complex and stressful phases of inspections, negotiations, and closing.
We certainly find convergence on the fact that navigating those specific transaction phases requires a dedicated, uncompromised advocate. The days of sub-agency and handshake deals are thankfully behind us.
Truly.
Whether that fiercely loyal advocacy is born directly from an ABR curriculum or from an agent's intrinsic professional rigor and experience remains the core of our disagreement.
Absolutely. And it highlights the immense value of looking closely at professional designations in any industry, rather than just taking them at face value. We have to ask what they actually require, what structural boundaries they enforce, and how those requirements genuinely change the practitioner's behavior when the pressure is on.
Yeah, it's worth digging into.
We invite our listeners to explore the source material from the Center for Realtor Development further, and perhaps to sit down with an ABR-certified agent in your own local market. Look at how they conduct that initial consultation, and form your own conclusion on the weight of the Accredited Buyers Representative designation when choosing your next real estate partner.
It is a conversation every single homebuyer should be having before they sign their name on any dotted line. The market is just too unforgiving to leave your representation up to chance.
Because at the end of the day, when you step into the real estate arena, you need to know exactly who is sitting on your side of the table. You wouldn't accept a defense attorney who works for the prosecution. Why should your standards be any lower for the person helping you secure your financial future?